Birth. The day my mother shat me out into this cruel world, I knew I was gonna be something fucking great. Sure, I was just a small, frail, ferret-like looking thing when I was scooped up out of her Samantha, but I swear there was a look in my eye of sheer omnipotence the second I breathed my first breath. Little did anyone know that I was a survivor. I was a champion, and I hadn't even lived for a minute. My conception in the 9.5 months of pregnancy leading up to and including the big day is an intriguing tale of love and deception, murder, malice, and mayhem. Indeed, my birth is a dramedy of accidents, misplaced babies, rejected pregnancies, and a hospital bill longer than my bungee-stretched umbilical cord. In the beginning. Have you ever stopped to wonder when you were conceived? I know our parents getting it on 80s porn style on their parents' couch is not something we all want to digest. I braved the research, and this is what I concluded as to approximately when my father's sperm reached my mother's egg. My mother was given a due date for my grand entree of April 1st, and this excited her knowing we'd be born in the same month as her birthday is April 25th. But I was late, just like I'm casually late for everything in my life today. I'm so late to events and things so often that I think my last will and testament should say that my body needs to arrive late to the funeral, just so I go out the same way I lived, like Liz Taylor did for her own funeral. Before she died, she willed her body to arrive tardy to her own funeral party, exemplifying the way she had lived her entire life, always late, but worth the wait. Knowing my real birthday is actually April 16th and that inevitably I was 2 weeks late, I could deduce approximately when I was conceived based on the initial April 1st verdict. And what did I come up with? That I was conceived the first weekend in July, the 4th of July weekend. Talk about some fireworks. And I say fireworks not like some Katy Perry song, but because this is truly where my story would begin at my conception. My mother had my sister 3.5 years prior to me, so she knew at least how to anticipate the agonies and the overall side effects of pregnancy, but my gestation was different. My mom has repeatedly said that being pregnant with me was enough to make her never want to get pregnant ever again. And then 2.5 years later, out pops my baby brother. You'd think she'd have learned by then where babies come from. She said that there was hardly ever any morning sickness while she was pregnant because nothing ever tasted good. She just never ate as much as she wanted to, needed to, and an underlying feeling of hunger resided within her almost the entire 40 plus weeks. I obviously was a Hollywood fetus keeping slim and trim through anorexia. My mother also hardly ever slept through the 9.5 months she was pregnant with me, and this drove each of us to the edge of murder. My mother spent more than 41 hours in labor. That's 2 days of huffing and puffing without any houses coming down and no baby being squirted out. I know that if it were me, I would have nurse jackied it and been pumped so full of morphine so fast before I spent 2 days with my feet in stirrups and my asshole stretched wider than Kirstie Alley's. But not my mother, oh no. Her body rejected the pregnancy 3 times before distributing me into the harsh reality that was 1982. I was birthed 2 weeks tardy and without an excuse. Or maybe I did have one. Later, the doctors would explain to my mother that her blood type is O positive. I, however, being the prodigal son, have type A positive. The doctors believed that our misaligned blood might have been one of the few factors that contributed to my mother's complicated pregnancy. On top of the blood confusions, and despite being carried to full term and beyond, I was born a tiny baby. My mother once said it looked like I'd been delivered in an African village by some back alley voodoo doctor. That's how small I looked. That and the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck 4 times might have also added complications to the pregnancy at hand. The doctor scooped me up out of my mother, and upon seeing the cord lassoed around my gullet, he immediately freaked out, but only for a second. He realized almost immediately that I wasn't being choked and that the cord was in fact loosely wrapped thrice around my neck. Therefore, he did not immediately cut the cord. He simply unraveled it from around my bloody head and then cut it. After that, 2 strange things happened. First, I laughed. Typically, doctors put a child over their knee or tap the baby's bottom to get them to cry to help them with their first few breaths of oxygen. Not me. That doctor unwrapped my human mom noose around my neck, and I burst out laughing in his face. He didn't have to swat me to get me to breathe because I took care of that myself, and then mocked him with a newborn giggle. The doctor noticed the second odd thing when he fully stretched out the umbilical cord's death grip. Normal mom to baby tubes are 30 to 36 inches long. Mine was 86 inches long. Very interesting, a cartoon doctor might say. Interesting, indeed. What did all this mean? The laughing, the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck, its extra long length, my being born skinnier than Twiggy in a tube top, and the extended, complicated pregnancy. What did all this mean? Why so much drama with one birth? This is what the doctors henceforth concluded based on the facts at hand. I had had a twin. My twin had died off during the pregnancy at some point, and I was the only one to survive. I offed my twin in a Darwinian fetal homicide to take my rightful place in the world and claim the egg for myself, so that at least one of us would defiantly survive. That's right, folks. The man who at 17 once run over a wild field rabbit in his GeoPrism in the late 90s and then called 911 to see if they could send a bunny ambulance to save it had committed murder before he was even born. I'd snuffed the light out of my twin's candle before I was even negative minutes old. Things got weirder on the day of my birth. Because I was born in the 80s in St. Louis, I wasn't necessarily exposed to the best medical technology available. However, the doctors did make a fascinating discovery as a result of my birth. Typically, umbilical cords can be used as vein transplants in places like one's arms or legs. In my case, my umbilical cord was nearly 3 times as long. According to the doctors, they were able to save and harvest my feeding tube and use it as a vein transplant in 3 different patients' legs. Out of the death of my unborn twin came light. Our umbilical cord saved the legs of 3 people from being amputated, and they were able to continue to use their stubs as a result of my extra long umbilical cordage. That transplant to me is still amazing, despite all of today's medical marvels and current breakthroughs. Of course, my mother, being the catty woman she is, didn't find it amazing when she got her Uber-inflated hospital tab. When she asked about getting a discount on the bill due to her baby's miracle salvage, the nurse at the front desk just laughed. Very much in the same way I laughed in the doctor's face when I was born. The irony. When babies are born, they are given a numerical identifying wristband that coincides with the wristband on the mother so that there are no baby mishaps or misidentified infants. One very traumatic thing happened to me whilst in the hospital shortly after my birth. My mother asked the nurse if she could hold me. I was currently being kept warm like an unhatched goose egg in the little baby incubator monitoring room. So the head nurse paged one of the other nurses to get me. My mother waited patiently with the first nurse for me to arrive when the second nurse came into the room holding a baby in her arms. My mother smiled at her, but the nurse took one look at my mother and then another look down at the baby in her arms and said, "Oh." My mother was puzzled. "Oh?" she asked the nurse, who had looked at her dumbfounded. "Oh, this is not your baby," the second nurse muttered, looking at the head nurse at my mother's side with fear and anxiety. Like a Catholic mother superior, the head nurse didn't react. She just calmly looked at her colleague and said, "What do you mean that isn't her baby? I read you off the wristband numbers. Didn't they match?" The baby cradling nurse said, "Oh, the numbers matched all right, but the baby doesn't." "What do you mean?" my mother interjected sharply, sitting up in bed. "What do you mean they don't match?" The nurse holding the baby looked down at the package she was holding in her arms and then again at my mother and moved in to give my mom a closer look. She said, "Well, unless somehow you gave birth to a black baby girl, then this is not your baby." Sure enough, my mother took one look at that little Nubian princess and just laughed. After all she'd been through with my pregnancy and birth, what else could she do? She just laughed. What's one more mistaken baby identity log to add to the shit fire? I was brought in to see my mom shortly after, and the nurses had little Beyonce and my bracelet switched. Apparently, a stillborn birthed in between myself and the little girl had made a mess out of the whole wristband number situation. So, that's the story of my birth. The crazy roller coaster that it was. There you have it. I was born bad, but through persistent efforts on the part of my mother, father, stepmother, and myself during the course of my childhood and early adulthood, I did end up developing into a somewhat well-rounded person. They say babies are born without sin, and I think in a weird way, my sin of offing my twin was inadvertently meant to be. The Christians believe that once a baby is baptized, she or he is given a clean slate, is deemed sinless, and able to take into the hands of God, and able to be taken into the hands of God if she or he should die. The funny thing is, I would still call 911 today if I ran over an animal on the road with my car. I could never hurt anyone. I even hate the sight of my own blood, so I obviously could never fathom killing anyone or anything. In a naturalistic way, my birth was my own baptism and cleansing. My brother slash sister slash unborn twin gave up his or her life so that I could be born. My birth gave an aspect of life back into 3 different strangers who were previously completely unaffiliated with my birth or mother whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying that I'm some sort of messiah or prodigy or that I was born perfect. Nor am I saying I am destined to do important shit. Nor does this mean my crazy birth should be looked at in any other light than just being another crazy birth. What I do know is things do happen for a reason. I survived, and I'm here to tell the tale today. Despite how absurd it may feel like at the time, life does happen for a reason, no matter how mysterious it appears to be. Who knows? Maybe I'm destined for greatness, or maybe I'm just along for the ride.